Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Yale Center for British Art's online program featuring works from our current exhibition, In a New Light, Paintings from the Yale Center for British Art. I am Mark Aronson, Deputy Director and Chief Conservator at the Yale Center for British Art, and I am delighted to welcome Kianja Strobert to our program today. In addition to presenting her own work, Kianja will talk about Francis Bacon's Study of a Head from 1952, currently on view in the exhibition, which features more than 60 paintings spanning 4 centuries of British landscape and portraiture traditions. The exhibition is on view at the Yale University Art Gallery through December 3rd. Some housekeeping. Before we begin, I have a few notes. Please note that this program will be recorded. Your camera and sound are muted and will remain so throughout the program. We will be using the Q&A feature located on your navigation bar to gather your questions for Kianja, and they will be answered at the end of the program, but please feel free to submit your questions at any time. If you would like closed captioning, a live transcript is available by clicking the icon on your navigation bar. Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous people and nations, including the Mohegan, Mashantucket Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Shattuck, Golden Hill Paugussett, Niantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquin-speaking people have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these people and nations and this land. About Kianja. Kianja Strobert received her MFA at the Yale School of Art in 2006. She works primarily in mixed media sculpture, works on paper, and paintings. She is known for her dynamic and expressive mixtures of abstraction and realism, in which themes of the mimetic are stretched across painting and sculpture. Her visual motifs, which orbit around conversations of class and labor, often pair images with flat spans of color. She has recently been appointed assistant professor in the Department of Art, Film, and Visual Studies at Harvard University. So welcome to our program, Kianja.
Thank you so much, Mark. Such a pleasure to be here. Of course, I want to thank the Yale Center for British Art, Courtney J. Martin, who is one of the reasons I'm here today, Jane Nowasadko, Linda Page, Amelia Ewan, and everyone else that got us to this point. And of course, not least you. I'm so tempted to say Professor Aronson still, because, you know, you were my professor. And I love taking your course. So this is really a lot of fun.
Thank you. It's really great to get back and see your most recent work. I had such a great time a week or two ago visiting your studio and seeing the success of former students. It's thrilling.
Thank you, Mark. So should we get into it?
Sure, let's get to the next image for sure.
Uh-oh. It seems to not be advancing.
Oh. What happens if I advance? Nothing. Okay.
Well, I'm going to stop sharing and reshare. Let's see if that works. Ah, there we go. Okay. So, you know, it's kind of fortuitous that we're coming back to this time of year, and that, you know, in our discussion, we came up with this beautiful building, right? Which is the building that houses the museum and the collection, because I spent so much time here during my studies at Yale. I didn't know if everyone else is a wanderer, but I love having sort of these secret spaces whenever I'm in a new institution. And I have to say that this was one of the most gorgeous spaces, and I would go and sit probably for way too long, essentially making my coat into a blanket. And I just love being in this building. So this is the library court. and the building is designed by Louis Kahn. And I mean, I think the picture says so much about the space for itself, but I just can't impress upon the world enough the importance of having a way to sit in front of a painting for a long time and observe it. And that's really what I did here. And of all the paintings that are displayed in this image, the one that I spent the most time looking at was the George Stubbs that's in the upper left corner. And I think this is a good primer for the main painting that we're going to speak on today. This is George Stubbs lying attacking a horse. And I mean, I don't know how many people here are familiar with his work. Of course you are, Mark, but this is such an active painting in the course of his career. I think of him as making like still images and really detailed paintings that are emblematic of an artist's ability to look and to capture. But I really love this image because of all the motion that was in it. This is a little aside. When I was younger, we had like a portrait hanging above the sofa, and I would stare, and the longer I would stare, it looked like I could get the lips to move and to pull apart. And that's kind of the same hallucination I would have sitting in this room. I remember this painting so differently than the way it looks now that we're together. But, you know, we're talking about painting a certain period, this is pre-television, so it has to have a lot of action. And you and I discussed this a bit, but part of that action, I think we want to talk about in terms of maybe even violence. But what I really came to the most is just like circular motion and how things are feeding in and around and onto each other again.
The painting strikes me as almost a note to what Paul Mellon loved to collect: landscape, sporting art, and portraiture. Here we're looking at a portrait of two animals in mortal combat, really. But it serves as a reminder of what the whole collection is about. I'm always impressed when I meet students who are looking at art of the past. Many of the art school students are so aware of what's going on in New York right now, or LA or Berlin, who's been doing what for the last 25 years, not the last 250. So it's really a pleasure to learn of your interest in this material. It wasn't something that I was aware of actually when you were in my class.
Yeah, you know, it's really funny because back then I think I kind of just wandered around and made all sorts of things and let them fall out. And I get my influences from everywhere, but I really believe, and I think my students who I teach now, I say this often to them, is that I'm really going to put you in a box, and your goal is to try to get out of the box, right? And the box is going to be what everyone else has done. And that way you don't have to like constantly invent from nothing, but also it puts you in dialogue with something else. And I think the community should be built over time. You know, like some of my best art friends have passed away 800 years ago. They have no idea that I exist, but they're reading the same literature, they're interested in the same ideas. And I feel like the human condition is, it's amazing how often the same story just takes on different forms, but is still there. So that brings us to this lovely, beautiful painting, which is the reason why we're here today. Maybe a stretch for some people to see the beauty in this, but I just adore it. I was a huge, and still am a huge fan of Francis Bacon. I think so many people love this work for a number of different reasons. But I have to say, as a young, I think he particularly appeals to young artists. First of all, there's the whole mythology of who he is and the way that he lived his life. And there's a sort of rebellious spirit to it, which I think most people have some sort of, even a vicarious thrill around Francis Bacon's paintings. And also I'm just like in awe and in love with the technique of it. I think of him as someone who is able to take something stable and embed it through the use of the paint with emotional content. So for those who don't, yeah, go ahead.
That's certainly a theme that we try and go through in class. it's not just a conversation about the influence of the picture, of the pictorial image, but it's also this: how does a given artist use their materials to deliver content? How can paint evoke violence, or paint evoke love, or whatever the emotion is? Can we embed that in the material and not just the pictorial image?
Yeah, I completely agree with that statement. I think, again, now teaching, I'm often pushing students to not think that the image is the thing that's going to dominate. Like, the paint has a life of itself. That's what you're wrestling with. It's part of the conversation. It doesn't have to end with like sort of the glossy image. How do you get there? I particularly love this image too, because I feel as if Francis Bacon is so good at taking images and putting them through the process of painting. And I think we'll talk about that in a second. So this, of course, is the famous study of a head. And even though I was not directly thinking about Francis Bacon, this is a piece that I recently made. And I mean, I think it fits very well into this context. And for a couple of reasons. One is, this is a piece that I made, and some of the things we're going to talk about today I wouldn't normally share, or I don't want them to be in front, but given that we're speaking, I'm going to divulge a little bit more. But the title of this piece is actually Pink and Green. And I tend to leave things kind of open, especially if I'm not in the room to discuss them, because I don't want there to be like a singular response to the work. I think that there should be layers, and I've certainly heard a lot of different responses coming back at me that I did not intend. I think that's actually very similar to the headpiece. I mean, you and I had different interpretations of it even a few days ago. On one hand, one can see horror, and then some other interpretations may be, I think, release is what you said.
Well, we were looking at this, and I believe this is an image taken from a Michael Jackson film, Thriller. And I was looking at it and saying, this is also is this an expression of terror, or is this an expression of joy? Say somebody who is seeing their grandmother for the first time in many years and just terribly excited. So there's an ambiguity there in this very picture, and your choice of it. But do you think the ambiguity is also in the Bacon head?
I personally, no. I see one thing. I wouldn't want to run into that head in the middle of the night. That's
Right.
That's kind of my metric. Which doesn't make it, I think, any less gorgeous to me. But it comes back to this idea, I think, of like source material and how certain artists are incorporating photography and film and kind of other genres and really using them to show what's inspiring to them. So I want to stay on this piece too long, but I just want to affirm you're totally correct. And again, that's something that comes up in conversation that I don't put out there, but this is a still from Thriller, because I want there to be some sort of latent understanding in whoever the viewer is, that somehow they understand this. I hope that translates to understanding the scream itself. I get these things printed at Staples, which is actually a lot of fun for me. I think they think I'm nuts. But when I walk in and the technician is pulling this massive screaming woman from a printer, it's actually a lot of fun. And I have to say that these are kind of recent developments in my work. And I mean, we can talk about that later, but really this is down to three things. There is something sculptural, which is the leaning plank. There's the painting, which is made directly onto the wall. And then, of course, the image. And I think we talked about this before, like in teaching and the influence, I think it's starting to pull my work apart a bit more. And so I'm putting things next to each other. But part of what I love now painting directly on the wall, and I get many interpretations about whether or not there's imagery on the wall itself. I think paint is very suggestive, and the physics of paint just inspires a kind of storytelling.
For me, looking at this work, immediately, aha, there's the British landscape. But I'm using my hammer, my tool of, I work at the Yale Center for British Art. And we look at Stubbs, we look at Gainsborough, or we look at Jones, and it's all about landscape. And so for me, it's like, aha, there's my handle. I don't know that that's where you are coming from, but it sings out. But another thing to ask you about is, this is an installation piece. You mentioned that you painted directly on the wall. So if it's reinstalled somewhere else, either you or somebody else would have to repaint the wall, perhaps in a different way, a different hand. But what is the role of the image we're seeing? You've had this photograph, and that itself is a very artistic expression of the work. Where does this, the documentation of the piece, stand in its life?
Documentation is becoming more and more important. And I've decided that I have to be in the room every time it happens now, because it is another way to tell the story. And I've been very lucky. I mean, Sean Corcoran's mentioned here, I've worked with some really brilliant photographers. But given that the reception of a work of art has changed so much, I think it's a new opportunity to talk about how something lives. And this is kind of a tangent, but going back to the role of the museum, like I've been in and out of museums my whole life, very, very fortunately. And it takes me to places that I cannot or have not physically gone before, which I think is important. Of course, it should be done ethically and with all of the conversations involved in that. But photography is, I think, stepping in a bit now in the way that images are disseminated. It's just incredibly important, and it is now part of a piece. And also, I want to say you're absolutely right. One thing I love about this piece is that I can't get too attached to it. And just to confirm, the color is called marsh green, so you're not completely off completely off the mark about bringing in the landscape, because I'm interested in labor and leisure, and that's very much why I chose that color. I feel as if I know a lot about Bacon, but of course I did some research for today. And in thinking about the head, I was shocked to find out that Bacon was also referencing a moving image. So on the left, we have the still from Sergei Eisenstein's Battleship Potemkin. And this is the scene, the Odessa Stairs scene, which is apparently very famous. I'm not going to make it up. I have not watched it. But of course, I'm familiar with this image. And on the right, there's the image from Bacon's studio of his using this image and the handprints. I'm a romantic. I love seeing how an artist touched something in these relics from their studio space. And that radically changed my perspective on this work. I mean, I always knew that Bacon was interested in Muybridge, but I had no idea how direct the reference is. And so I think we can see here in putting these two images side by side, that violence isn't only kind of an inner state that's coming out, it's actually part of the topic of conversation. And it's a way to, it's not a copy, but you can see even by the angle of the glasses, the spectacles that the woman is wearing in the image on the left, that there is a faith inside Bacon to reproduce something. And then that just actually really blew my mind. Also be able to see so directly, how the rim of the glasses turns into just a gesture of the brush. And I don't know, I think it's just like quite beautiful and has radically changed part of my opinion of him and his work.
For me, one of the brilliant things of Bacon's interpretation of the image is the way he's used the texture and the gesture of paint in that, I would argue, violent way, that the paint itself is carrying that message. The photograph maybe is a little bit smooth and finished, and maybe take some of that energy out in the way we respond to the pictorial image more than we respond to the physical image. And so Bacon is using the physicality of paint to express the violence in the way that the still does not.
And that's, of all of Bacon's amazing gifts, I think that's, the number one thing that I respond to in his work. The amount of impasto that's on these surfaces, and when they're not impasto, so it's about the surface tension and the physicality of the paint. I know that he's using oil paint, but also like anything else that's around, which is also something I do because it sits differently on canvas. Also, I mean, we're getting a little bit away from texture for a second, because I just want to say this idea of like the scream and the hysterical woman, which is something I was thinking of in my work. It's interesting. I'm not sure if this comes up enough in Bacon, especially when you can see such a direct translation that's happening here. So I just wanted to talk a little bit too, because, you know, in the intro, you mentioned how I look to the past, and I do quite often, but I really don't think that that's very uncommon, or at least it wasn't uncommon a long time ago. And so Bacon has really said some incredible things against education. And I think that that's really interesting. And, you know, he can say whatever he wants. But I think it's interesting to like broaden the idea of what education is, because I do firmly believe, even when it has put me in a bad corner, that I'd rather know than not know. And I feel like Bacon has actually a pretty fabulous education in painting. It's just self-directed. So I was really happy to see this image. So on the left, it's interior of a room, and he's working with space. He, you know, has said before how he's really influenced by Picasso. But what I love is at the bottom right, you can see this like drawing of a dog. And that's from a painting by Piero della Francesca, who was someone who meant a great deal to me when I was kind of that final semester and I was studying at Yale. And I don't know, it's like a little game, but I love to find the influences that happen. I think that's why it's so nice to look at early work. And I have no idea why this dog painting by Piero della Francesca is so important. I tried to copy it at some point during that same time. Many other people have. And that kind of brought me to starting back on our talk of where I was when we first met, and what I was making when you and I, when I was in your course. So I remember, I shouldn't say names, I'm going to, because I think he'd laugh. Peter Halley was like, everyone should take Mark Aronson's course. And I was like, I'm in Mark Aronson's course. And he's like, you're working on newsprint. Like, you need to digest what Mark is teaching you. Which I know wasn't
he didn't realize maybe that I was a rebel in my teaching about materials.
Well, exactly. I feel like that was not the point of what was happening. The point was to like grow this awareness of what materials will do, not to change whether or not you're going to use them. And that's something I just thank you for, because I did learn that. And so these are some drawings I was making at the time. And I was also in a course called Infinity and Perspective, which was by Professor Carson Harries, which was an amazing course. And that's where I learned about Leon Battista Alberti's De Pictura on painting, and also about Piero della Francesca's treatise on painting too, both in the mid to late 1400s. They're about 50 years apart. Anyway, as you know, I had like a personal tragedy at the time. My father passed away, and I had been trying to like pump up painting, as in like with a canvas and a brush. And, you know, after significant loss, I think that those things just go by the wayside. And I thought, okay, why am I stressing about this? This is obviously is not what I want to do. And so I just I emptied out the studio, got a newsprint pad and then graphite and an eraser. And I started making these drawings based on the way that Alberti particularly lays out space, which is very easy. And I still teach it to students. And that's what I mean about finding your own voice inside of something. And I think that Bacon actually does this too. Like in Bacon paintings, you'll see he puts someone in a box. And I think that we could talk forever about that's a new, like a digital box, but what I think it does, it just sets up something that is, I'm going to say right, which is what I wanted, and sets up the framework so that you can see what the paint is pushing against. And so I'm going to move on soon, but like in the image on the right, I was obsessed with Frank Stella. I was listening to Frank Stella and Larry Kuntz and I have since I was like 18. I found an audio cassette, which is ridiculous. So it's like, okay, I got to get rid of Stella. So I put a black painting on fire. And then we talked about a certain figure that was leaving my life. So his leg is running out the right side, and someone in prayer and someone falling down a hole. And to me, that is what is so helpful to me about learning about the past, which is I didn't feel like I had to completely invent it. I think you and I spoke too. This is another one of those drawings for me on the left. And there was some language there about my father, which I erased. But I read somewhere that an early halo was a black square. And so I have a figure kind of falling back into a void. I think when
you're looking at Francis Bacon at this time as well. This is a Francis Bacon drawing where we believe he was looking at Van Gogh. So,
yeah.
so you're looking at an artist who's looking at an artist and taking it from there.
Absolutely. I mean, Bacon has a huge series based on Van Gogh, which is really interesting. But for today, I wanted to show this because his mark making is just incredible in the psychological storm that he can brush up. You know, again, I don't want to see this figure in the middle of the night. Like this, I feel as if this drawing, which is oil and paper, I'm going to call it a drawing, has so much presence that I want to run away from it, actually. And that's just incredible. So I was looking at Bacon. I was also looking a lot at David Hockney and his drawings from the same period, about the 1950s, because I think they both do a great job at using agitation to suggest motion, which is as old as the Lascaux cave paintings, and presence and absence. I just love to look at them. It's just my taste. I think Bacon also contributed a lot technically. So you and I have talked about gesso.
Right. Gesso is the classic foundation of a painting materials class is how to make gesso. It's the simplest paint, pigment and glue. And everybody, it seems forever, seems to start their teaching with how to make gesso and how to gesso a panel. In fact, when Peter Halley asked me to teach, he said, "Mark, I don't want you to teach a copy class." But even so, we started with gesso. Start with gesso.
Yes. And I remember, and you know what? I'm trying to not say hate. I strongly dislike gessoing things. I mean, I work on paper a lot because it's immediate. And I try not to work on white pieces of paper because I'm facing my own void and my own, inabilities with a white piece of paper. It's just like a genius problem. So I like a piece of newsprint is perfect for me. It's casual. It already has some information there. And, I look to the past a lot because sometimes I feel like I'm out on a limb and then I learn that I'm not. And that kind of can make it okay to move forward. Not every bravery comes from that, but this is one of my favorite Francis Bacon paintings. It's on, I'm going to say linen, looks like linen to me. It is not gessoed. And that's a real, I think, technical marvel, or I don't know, a rebellious act, these small rebellious acts that we have. Because, if it's not gessoed, it's going to change a little bit over time. What it allows the canvas to do is to hold on to the dry paint so much better. It's like a rough texture to work on. And therefore, you get Bacon's, his style.
Sure. And Bacon's paint, as you pointed out, they're all about, one of the things they're about is texture. And, a gessoed canvas is a way for an artist to control the surface and create illusion, whereas Bacon wants maybe not to get too much into formal illusion, but the expressiveness of the physical laying on of paint. So he's working on a very dry surface. There's no varnish, there's no gesso. The paint seems to sit in space. When you get up close to them, some of the paint is actually quite thick. And so he's using paint as his expressive medium, not just as pictorial space. So, this is just a brilliant picture that has a wide expanse of raw linen, probably very expensive raw linen.
I'm sure it is. I mean, I'm also interested in Bacon's life. We're not going to talk about that too much today, but there's so many great videos. And I just want to plug one, which is this fabulous series called Arena, which I guess is in the 80s in London. and you can watch a bacon video, and then you can watch a polystyrene video, and they're both they both will put you in the same headspace. Yeah, I adore this painting. I think it's amazing. And I think, you know, one thing I tell my students and I tell myself is I'd like have fun in your studio. I mean, these jokes maybe don't make a lot of sense to non-painters, but I can see this as a move that makes someone smile because it's kind of going against the grain. I should also say that, you know, this horizontal line that's happening behind is, again, a very like Renaissance presence that's happening here. It's like interrupting one point perspective. The circle on the ground is like dead in the center. And so he's like elbowing out like the strict structure, but it's absolutely there and does so much for setting up space. And I think the cars in the background, which are like cartoonish and strange in their own way. You know, I found out apparently this is like his view from his home in Monte Carlo. So there's also that. But how do you take what you see and put it into a structure? I think Francis Bacon does that so well. You know, texture has been really important to me in my work. And I would consider these, even though they're paintings and they've been out in the world, I think I consider these to be more like notes. I just love impasto. And for those who don't know, impasto means like the heavy application of paint. So the paint itself becomes very sculptural on whatever surface you're working on. You know, I've also had this question for a long time, which is why am I only using, or why would I only use materials that you buy in the art supply store? That seems a bit removed from me, from life and the everyday and what, I don't know. So I embed, in addition to using sort of paint with like a heavy hand, I also include things that are just happening around in my world. So I eat a lot of like tangerines for some reason in the studio because you can peel them and they don't get dirty when they roll around. My studio is a mess. And, you know, I may embed these things into the paint. And most of the time I'm responding to something formal. You know, I love that bright orange color. And, you know, I think it's a question for artists that each person answers on their own. You know, what is your relationship to change in the work? So, you know, we've talked about this, that these materials are going to change. They're going to decay. They may even mold. I know it doesn't, in these pieces, it doesn't bother me. I feel differently about other things that I make. But this was definitely a period where I was having fun trying to get the world to take these seriously.
So we haven't talked about this, but a museum collects one of these paintings and you get this letter asking you, the tangerine peel has discolored to brown and 2 of them have fallen off. Can we replace it with a new piece of tangerine? Or do you want the aged object to show its age and everything original stay that way?
You know, again, it's kind of piece by piece. I really don't know how I feel at this exact moment, to be perfectly honest. I'd love to say, oh yeah, just replace it. And there are other artist works where I know things are replaced, but because this has paint on top of it, I'm getting a little bit of resistance internally right now to that. And maybe leaving the decayed thing underneath the paint is part of this work. But I would feel very differently for other pieces. And now I'm kind of obsessed with making things very stable. So this has turned into an old problem. But again, I think it's about the private world of the studio and how I enjoyed it in that moment. And I think different artists are making work for different reasons. At this moment, I was just trying to keep working.
Is your shift to stability one driven by looking for stability in your life, or is it driven by something as simple as market forces that your collectors want stable works?
I think it's kind of everything. I mean, these actually were acquired. So collectors have been pretty generous to me. I'd have to say that. You know, I am in a different place in life. And someone said a challenge to me, and we're actually gonna get to that in a second, so I don't want to ruin it. So I'm gonna pick that back up. But at different times, I'm interested in different things. My practice changes all the time. So sometimes I really want to make something beautiful and gorgeous and tackle all the problems. And sometimes I want something to be made very quickly. And it's really a case by case basis. I think I'll go back. Oops. Uh-oh, sorry. I'm all over the place. Anyway, so we'll get to that in a second. But just to go back to kind of like Francis Bacon's idea of texture and the stability. I mean, even though this looks very stable because it's oil paint, I mean, I know and you know that there are other things that are in here. So other things may change over time, even with this work. And it may be minuscule, but I don't know, I'm just kind of embracing it. I think, just to come back to this piece and the texture, I didn't know what more to say about it, but just that everyone should look at them and enjoy them.
Yeah.
Enjoy all the marks.
I'll put in a plug. We were talking about how we photograph things. Bacon loved everything behind glass. He wanted all his paintings behind glass, which is a very British thing, frankly. When our colleagues come to the British Art Center and they see our paintings here, and most of them are not glazed, some of them are really shocked. In the 19th century, glazing paintings was the thing. It was the latest varnish, really. Bacon wanted his things behind glass, and it's protective for sure from surface dirt, but it also makes enjoying them from their haptic textural point of view a little more difficult. And so, I took this picture earlier this week because I ran over there and wanted to get some pictures of the thing and its texture. And I start taking these weird, strange angle photographs, but to try and convey some of that texture.
Mm-hmm. I mean, my feeling. I'm anti-glass.
Right.
I mean,
right.
I mean, I think it's such a part of the emotional feeling, and I need better words than emotional. But standing in front of this again, I believe that certain things get distilled in the way that you handle paint, way that one handles paint. And when it gets flattened behind the glass, I know it's protected, but I'm kind of like, as a person who's doing the same thing you're doing, which is dancing in front of it to see all the edges. Also, I think it makes me a little self-conscious to always be looking at my own reflection in everyone else's painting. But I get it. So much information out there about Bacon is radical. I think his work is radical for a number of the reasons that we talked about. But there's also a lot of structure to Bacon's work. So, this is an amazing triptych. And obviously, this is about, the passing of someone who's important in his life. And I think it is interesting how much he dealt with figures who were in his actual social circle, as well as looking sometimes outside to figures who are more symbolic. But also, I think of Bacon as just practicing so much. For all of the kind of inspiration that's attributed to him. I mean, he has many triptychs. Triptychs is important for a number of reasons. Certainly 3 is the magic number, which Schoolhouse Rock taught us, but also it's such a human number, beginning, middle, and end. I often work in 3s also, just because that just gives me a feeling of completion. I don't know why. I don't have like a big intellectual reason. It just seems like the right thing. And I adore this portrait for so many reasons. Another thing that we talked about a little bit just together is I remember, and I'm not a Bacon scholar, but I remember learning back in the day how when Bacon was stuck, he would just throw a white glob of paint at the surface of a painting. And, you can see a white glob here, and that would keep the painting going. I think that's something that comes up a lot for me in teaching, which is like, if you don't know what the right thing is to do, just do the wrong thing. And, I think students get different things from different professors, but the way that I work, if someone's looking at a painting of mine, they're looking at me problem solving on the canvas. And I think that that's something that Francis Bacon is doing, which is why he gets such interesting distortions.
Is the next slide your triptych? Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And you can see that happening. So Mark, I frame these without glass. and they're graphite on paper is the first layer, or at least the top half of these images. I rub them in very much, but they're going to change over time. And then I remember when I made this painting, this was an interesting day because I dipped my brush into just like the muck, because you get this like mucky water from cleaning your brushes, and that's how that kind of pink color came down for the ground. So even though I've made many triptychs at this point, I really love to use 3 because it was very fast, and I was like in the moment the entire time. And I think that that's something that mark making can say. Okay. So now we're going to move into like a totally different world, because you and I were speaking a bit about, I mean, that's what this whole conversation is like artists being inspired by other artists. And so this is another painting that you have in your collection, right? The Blacksmith Shop. I think there's an interest in painting because of the way it looks. I think there's also sometimes an interest in painting because of what it symbolizes. And, I know this is a painting that sort of heralded in the Industrial Revolution as an interesting topic. And I always think about the blacksmith shop in my own studio just because I'm kind of a worker that way. I'm a very 9 to 5. As you know, I don't have lights in my studio. So I get up with the sun, and when the sun's down, I'm done. And there's kind of like a percolating energy to it. And so for a while, I was making images, which I think get detail as being abstract, but to me, I can kind of hear the noise of a shop inside of them. And I can certainly hear that in the Joseph Wright of Derby painting.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wanted to show this painting. Again, this has never been seen, but just like an early experiment trying to force sculpture into painting. And this hasn't left my studio because I don't find it yet done or successful or where I need it to be. But, I think we start to get into subject matter. I think sometimes it's an interesting idea to leave behind one thing for something else that can say a bit more. And so that's kind of my current relationship with painting. I'm going back and forth between these two worlds quite a bit. But yeah, I think you can see here too, interest in labor. Mm-hmm.
Do you also see this as a landscape?
I see landscape elements in it. I think I'm still confused with, or I've been trying to pin down whether this is from above or if it's going back like a window. And maybe that's one of my frustrations of why I'm still working on it. I think it's like 4 or 5 years already.
The elements on the floor are part of the work, or are those pieces waiting to be applied?
I have no idea. I have no idea still. No, I always want to put sculptural objects in front of the painting. I put them on. I have these like long dagger things I stab, to hold the things in place while I'm looking at them. And so as I work more with installation, this is what's happening. It's all kind of falling out of the same place.
Right.
Okay, so I mean, we've talked about this before, but this was a piece actually that I was making at the same time at Yale. I was making those drawings. So there's always been a tension between, the two-dimensional service and painting as a window, and then something that's more sculptural. Ultimately, this piece ends up being about 600 feet long, and every 200 feet you get a blue and a red. I think it's obvious association with the American flag, but also something like bunting, which is like kind of like these party decorations. It was always shown on the floor, and I didn't know, it's kind of like a beginning of starting to think about like gesture and how gesture moves out of painting into something else.
You explained that this was also started out as a traditional painting, and then it wasn't working for you, so you cut it up or you shredded it. And isn't that a perfect example of telling students, if it's not working, just do something that you think is wrong and maybe something will come of it?
Absolutely. Yeah, after a while, I'm trying to pump something up. You should just give up. I'm a big one for like, yeah, give up. That's okay. It doesn't mean that you're a failure. Like, this felt so right to make. And it's also very mechanical. And I think weirdly enough, that goes back to the Renaissance and having this structure that is, I mean, again, I'm going to say right, but just like mathematical, that doesn't, you don't have to think about. It's just like you become an instrument. And those are my best days in the studio. And that has translated now to something that's more contemporary. So for a while, I was making these kind of trough pieces. And, you know, I have a pattern to this. So I go in and I have my overalls and I'm folding this metal lath material, which I came to from physically building the studio itself, because I thought I was going to stucco it, which I have learned I will not stucco a whole building by myself. But there's, you know, the influence of painting is always with me and always kind of behind as the shadow, but I think it's important to touch many different kinds of things. And this starts to make its way into installations and other experiments and reintroducing the photograph. And I have to say that these moves actually aren't easy. I wish I could say, oh, I'm just using a photograph today. But I think when you've become like a painter and when the world enters the studio a little bit too much, it becomes hard to break away from that. And so in the past few years, I've just been having a really great time deciding that I'm just going to spend all of my time and my money, my resources making these notes, and they may go nowhere, but it just gives me a different way of touching. And of course, these are bins that look like they're filled with paint. So I'm still trying to reconcile.
Where are you drawing your color, your palette?
Oh, it's complete.
This work seems to be more highly keyed, less subdued, more vibrant.
Yeah, I mean, it's largely intuitive.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll walk through a space that has lots of colors, an art supply store or a chain store, and I just look at the color, and sometimes it feels like it wants to be bigger, and sometimes it doesn't work out at all. Sometimes it's just not the right format for it. You can see the one that's on the wall that has the brown and the green. I mean, that is a bit more of me experimenting with the idea of landscape. But again, very loosely, and every once in a while someone takes a chance and shows these experiments that I'm working on. And that's just a detail of the hands that they're playing in the background. You know, I came back to this piece too, which is a recent, I mean, this was a couple of years ago. It was a show at a space called Art Oh My, which is in Ghent, New York. And again, it's a large space and there's wall painting that's happening. But you know, this fidelity to the square is something I've been thinking about for a long time. And I think I've kind of gotten away from it. But this was the final piece where I did have a painter in mind. Which is Manet's Déjeuner sur l'herbe, which is a painting that I actually have. I understand why it's important, but I can't say I love that painting for probably reasons that are very contemporary and have nothing to do with when the painting was made. But sort of like this picnic and who's doing the work at the picnic, and you know, how do we get these objects, and when does one get to take a break? I mean, the title of this whole show was "When is Brunch?" I mean, this was also at the tail end of COVID. And I think it just gave me an opportunity to start to play, as you just know this, play with color, play with coming kind of maybe out of the workman's shop and back into the world in a sense. But still all the complicated questions that arise for me in doing that. And that work before is what now kind of gives me the freedom to paint on the walls, quickly involve images. And I think to just stop overthinking what's happening in the studio. I mean, Francis Bacon's paintings to me look so fresh and so in the moment. And I think that's actually challenging to do. I hear a lot, you know, when someone walks to a museum and they say, oh, that looks like a child painted it. And I have a new perspective on this, which is, yeah, but it's so hard for an adult to do it. You have to get over a lot to paint like a child and put it on the wall. Like every fiber of your being at this point, that would have been beaten out of you. And so there's something kind of freeing about making something that is fast and maybe ridiculous and even printed. Oh my gosh. And what is that like? And I think that has actually much more to do with the contemporary world.
Does the child have the advantage of not knowing all of the history and all the precedents and all the artists that you know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's what makes painting so difficult, I think. Now I'm back in a place where I just found the right size of painting for myself that feels like a piece of paper again. So, you know, I'm freer with it, but yeah, I went through many, and I think this is one of the conversations that people have about education. Because I went through many years where every time I was about to touch a canvas, I knew 8 million artists who did it. You know, I don't want to be completely, oh yeah, it's company. It can also be incredibly debilitating to know too much. But then I think there's just a process to get over that as well. It's a kind of like, oh well, you know, yes, that has happened. And so I just want to share some of the more recent works that have happened, um, which involve painting, I think involve all the concerns of painting, but now I'm in a totally different space. So when you asked about, you know, whether it's market pressure or what has pushed me into this realm of wanting to make things a bit more stable, I think part of it's also craft. Um, so I had an idea. I wanted to make a bench, and this came out of working with that marsh green for so long, and also thinking about, okay, how do I want to use images to put me somewhere else? So I said, okay, I'm going to make this bench, and I had an opportunity to show it, and the gallery I'm working with said, okay, great, but it's got to be stable. We're not in the situation. They're like, we're going to use it. It's not going to have furniture on it. And I say, okay, really? Because I'm just like an artist and I'm making this thing. But it was a wonderful challenge. And it really kind of upped the ante quite a bit. And it was so much fun to make. And so now I'm making these objects which have some function, but also now I can put people like inside the work with me, if that makes sense. It's not as if you're standing in front of a painting at a distance and you can't enter it. It's almost as if, you know, that window has expanded and now I can use objects to put you in a different place. So this is a bench and it's very brilliantly titled Bench. And you can sit on it and you can touch it. And every single square inch of it is made by me and made by hand, right? I don't have the tools yet to spread the surface in a way. And so my fingerprints are in there, and so it has so much touch that's involved with it. I don't mind saying, you know, it's a combination of wood and plastic, and also, I mean, you're a materials person, so I'm gonna share. But I'll say that this is one where I really went, it really has kind of changed my practice in the sense that there's about 4 layers of work to get to the final image. And each layer, the material has to be repainted and dyed, even though it's going to be covered again, and then covered again and covered again. So if there was a chip on this bench, no one would ever know about it. It's the most stable thing.
We only have a few more minutes. I wonder if, is there another piece you want to jump to or take a question or two?
Oh, I mean, questions are great.
Yeah, there's a pair of questions that came in. One is, what made you decide to become an artist, and what do you have? What kind of advice do you have for anybody who's aspiring to be an artist?
Well, what made me want to become an artist? I grew up in an artistic household. So I think I was always surrounded by the arts, music in particular, but also painting. And so I just didn't question it. I think also I was good at it. You know, I could draw, and drawing is so important. And I think I was encouraged to draw. Biggest advice that I have is to take it seriously. And by that, I mean, all the things that we've been talking about today, which is not just what you are painting or making, but how are you going to make it? I think it's really important to understand how to set up pictorial space, to be interested in the different ways that colors behave, to not take the actual material for granted, because I think that's one of the great pleasures of being an artist and working.
David Kimball Anderson writes in that he is struck, thanks you for this conversation, but he's struck by the relationship and similarities between Bacon's interior of a room and Matisse interiors. Do you think about Matisse? What are your thoughts about that relationship?
Well, I can see that relationship very clearly. Do I have any evidence that that Bacon was directly looking at Matisse? Not so much, but I mean, Matisse is another artist who did so many things.
Are you looking at Matisse in your work, or not at all?
I look at Matisse because it's good to look at Matisse. I'm not sure if I can point him out directly as in like a work is inspired, but I look at many things. I mean, I go to a lot of museums. Yeah, I teach using Matisse quite a bit. So, yeah.
The next question is a bit longer, from James Hall. In the Bacon head, the violence and asymmetry of paintwork and broken glasses crash like waves against the immovable perfection, centrality and integrity of the head's elongated oval and the mouth's circularity. Bacon admired Brancusi. He qualifies to the tragic nature of the woman's situation in the battleship in Temkin source. In a different way, Kianja's work also gets energy from crashing different types of image and medium together. I guess it's not so much a question as an observation. Do you have any response to that?
Yeah, I mean, that's perfect for the next slide.
Okay.
And I'll go through it really quickly because that's exactly what I'm doing, right? I look around inside images, especially now. This is kind of my new work for things that I like. This is an old Listerine ad. I'm particularly drawn to images of African-American people of a certain class at the moment. And that's a whole different conversation. But that's where this image, it's an old Listerine ad. And a lot of the hands that I picked are from Budweiser ads. And, you know, in this next image, that's a candle that was by my bed, which I didn't mean to totally cement into this painting, but now it's into the bench, but now it's gone and in there. So yeah, I think that's exactly where I am right now. And one, you know, I'm still making maybe 6 different kinds of projects, which are all very different, but that's definitely one project that has a life that keeps going. Or approach, I should say. Yeah.
I guess I'll take the last question. And we've talked about this before, but in your teaching, when do you think it's useful to tell an artist or ask an artist, have you seen works of this artist or that artist, or could you go look at this, please? When do you tell people to look at art of the past versus explore their own theoretical blank slate?
You know, that's kind of, it's a multi-part, multi-answer. So if you're in a beginning painting course, I mean, all of my courses, we go to the library. It's just my favorite place. We go to the museum quite often, no matter where I'm teaching. I think it's incredibly important for a number of reasons. One is that it's not as if you're only talking with artists in this field, right? I talk with art historians, I talk with conservators and curators, and you know, there is a language and a history that they're often researching, and it just makes for a denser, more interesting conversation. Also, I think it's fun to know. I mean, I love many works of art, period. So if I stopped with only what I made, I mean, I'd be really depressed all the time, I have to say, because it's not easy. So now, whether or not it's always helpful, yeah, sometimes it's not helpful. Sometimes someone is in the zone and they shouldn't break out of it, but the whole point, I think, of certainly something like graduate school is to develop for yourself when to know when something is helpful and when it is not. Just a quick example, when I was working on this piece, I think the Jasper Johns show was up at the Whitney. I know quite a bit about Jasper Johns, and I saved myself the trouble of having a heart attack that this was just going to be like completely derivative of his work, and I did not go. I did not go. I know a lot about Jasper Johns. I didn't feel too bad about not going. And I had to be protective. And I do
Right.
not regret it for a second.
Okay. Well, I regret to say that our hour is up. This has been a fascinating and enjoyable conversation we've had, and I want to thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Mark. Always a pleasure.
All right. And thank you to the audience that have joined us today. In a New Light, selections from the British Art Center is on view at the Yale Art Gallery until December 3rd. I encourage you all to come and visit. Thank you.
Thank you.